Hey, this is Rick Hess. Great to have all of you here with us today for this conversation. Why did America get pandemic schooling so wrong? 5 years ago, this spring, America's school systems shut down pretty much across the nation and pretty much within the span of about a week and a half during mid and late March. Looking back, there's widespread agreement that American education failed our kids during the ensuing 5 years. Prolonged school closures, uh, awful and rickety remote learning led to devastating academic losses. We've seen rising chronic absenteeism and a breakdown in parental trust in the education system. This is filtered out in all kinds of ways, driving interest in various forms of choice, in microschooling. Um, but what we really want to talk about today is, how we got this so wrong. Why did schools remain closed so long? Why did this? Why did the folks who were waving the flag and saying that this was wrongheaded and destructive not get the hearing that they probably deserved? Why did so many embrace COVID theater? Uh, Overdone masking mandates, other various ineffective measures, or measures that seem in retrospect to have been largely ineffective. That's the conversation today. But most importantly, not just how do we look back, but how do we draw out the lessons that help us think about how do we get school improvement right going forward? How do we help recover from the mistakes of COVID? What lessons can we take more broadly about what we need to do in schooling? I could not think of a better panel today to help us delve into this. We're going to start with David Zweig, the author of An Abundance of Caution, American Schools, the Virus, and a Story of Bad Decisions, a new book that's now been out, I guess, about 6 or 8 weeks, which is hugely worth the read. Just a fascinating and telling compendium of what happened and why schools stayed closed during the pandemic when so many schools across the developed world rapidly reopened. We also have with us Derrell Bradford, the president of 50 Can, who was a fierce voice during the pandemic for getting schools open and making sure they were serving kids well. And Emily Oster, professor of economics at Brown University and the CEO of ParentData. And I'm hoping maybe Emily will say a word or two about ParentData, because I think many of you on the call will find it really interesting. And Emily, for those of you who follow this, was perhaps the researcher who was doing the most to make sure that folks were informed about the actual risks that were playing out and how those were or were not driving decisions about education. If it's okay, David, I'd love to start with you with just a few questions that help us frame this out and that give you a chance to help folks understand some of what you tackle in the book. Um, your book is titled An Abundance of Caution. Big picture, how did the notion of an abundance of caution lead us astray? And how is this cautionary principle, which seems so sensible, how did this lead to bad outcomes for so many kids?
Yeah, thanks for having me. And it's a great question to start off with. I title my book An Abundance of Caution. It's a bit tongue in cheek, but because that phrase was used by anyone as essentially like a mic drop, that once you're doing something out of an abundance of caution, who is a parent or some other person to question something, to being cautious? So in some ways, and it's that, and there were several other sort of rhetorical techniques that were used to essentially make debate impossible or very challenging in a lot of circumstances. And what I spend 450 pages on in the book is, well, caution for whom, and caution in which direction? Look, we could lock ourselves in our homes and never get hit by a car, but you're also locked in your home, and that's not a way to spend your life. We tolerate all sorts of risks in our day-to-day lives, and we tolerate them with children. A certain number of kids will incur harm in any given day and in a given year attending school. They might get in a car accident on the way to school. There might be bullying. There could be a whole range of things. But yet during the pandemic, this notion that there was supposed to be this kind of zero harm idea was implemented and then calcified within at least half the country in the sort of blue state, blue areas in America. And you mentioned sort of cautionary principle, and I spend a lot of time in the book talking about what is the precautionary principle exactly, and what people perceived to be cautionary was actually not so. And a lot of what I do in the book is media criticism and even more so criticism of the public health establishment and the sort of expert class. And in many regards, my book is really a case study of the failure of the experts. And when you think about precautionary principle, that's based on an idea that you're making an assumption about a certain degree of risk of harm or negative consequence from something, and you're also making an assumption about a lack of harm or poor consequences from the other. And this sort of false kind of weighing of the scale that we had in the pandemic, in particular for children, is what led to such an absurd and disastrous consequence. Just as my closing thought here to your first question is, I don't think it's been sufficiently reckoned with how radical of a circumstance this was, that you had healthy kids, millions of healthy children stuck in their home month after month after month after month, and I could keep going on, while at the same time, adults could go to a bar, could go to a restaurant, a casino, and continue on. This was an absurd circumstance. And it's something that's why I wrote this book, and why I'm glad we're talking today about this. It's something that has just not sufficiently been dealt with.
I love this. And I mean, I think one of the keys here about looking back to look forward is not necessarily the specific conditions of the pandemic, but you talk about the culpability in the book a lot of the research community and of the journalistic community and how they weighed these risks. Who is more culpable in your mind, and how do we think about why they got this so wrong?
Yeah, ultimately it comes down to the experts, the quote unquote public health experts, in my view, because nothing else can happen if they don't make such poor, if they hadn't gone so astray. So you had a circumstance where our experts, the people we're supposed to trust in our country, were giving, to be quite honest, false information and certainly misleading information over and over. And then that false and misleading information was amplified by a legacy media apparatus that their job as journalists is supposed to be skeptical, to be curious, to question the claims made by people in power. Instead, and I give a litany of examples of this in the book where I dissect these large New York Times pieces that were very, very influential in the public conversation, where over and over they had experts cited, and sometimes they weren't even named, it was just unattributed. Experts say, the consensus is, and there was never evidence. So you have bad information, and then you have the filter, the fourth estate, who are supposed to be questioning this information and investigating and pushing for evidence, for some sort of empirical claims behind this, but instead they acted as a megaphone. And this led to a country that was deeply, deeply misinformed. I just did an interview on an NPR station in Los Angeles, and I was talking about my book, and a person called in and said, I had no idea that schools in Europe reopened in the end of April, the beginning of May. I was like, that is and this is an NPR, this is a failure of our media and a failure of the expert class. So Ultimately, it goes down to the experts, but the media plays such an important role, particularly influential media like the New York Times and others, because that's who influences the sort of elites in America and the people who are making decisions.
One more question, Dave, before I kind of get Emily, get you and Darrell, get you two into this, is in a lot of the narratives about pandemic school closure, the unions play a really large role, the teacher unions. They don't, they're certainly there in your book, and you certainly don't give them a pass. But in your telling, they seem to be a smaller part of the story. Is that fair? And if so, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean, make no mistake, as you noted, the unions certainly are an important part of my book, but the unions are really opportunistic. They could not have done what they did without the public health establishment allowing this to happen. The unions, in my view, could not have continued to make these claims. Imagine if Anthony Fauci had gone on TV in one of his, thousands of interviews he gave and said, look, the claims made by the Los Angeles Teachers Union that they want, HEPA filters and they want cancellation of rent and they want a special tax for millionaires. This is absurd. I'm a public health professional and I'm saying this is not going to prevent, harm to kids and to the community or something. But he never did, and nor did most of the public health establishment. So because of the poor information from the establishment and then from the media, that enabled teachers unions to kind of run with it. And then you have things like this list of demands from various unions. The one from LA was particularly just almost like a liberal fever dream of demands. None of this could have happened had one, we've been given correct information to begin with, and two, that when these demands are being made and the marches with the child-sized coffins and the hysteria and the histrionics that took place. Now, I don't want to ascribe ill will and say that there weren't people who were genuinely afraid, but the fact is they were afraid in large degree because they were deeply misinformed. We knew as early as beginning of April that teachers in schools that were open, because in Sweden they never closed, and they put out a study very early, they were at no higher risk than other professionals. I think taxi drivers were at higher risk than the teachers who remained in school. And we had data from Europe at the end of April, beginning of May, when they began reopening schools. Not just one little country, it wasn't a tiny schoolhouse in Denmark. 22 countries there reopened schools. In the end of April, beginning of May, the education ministers of the EU met. So this is an official body. This wasn't in an obscure journal. This wasn't in, like a blog post. This is the EU. And they said, we've observed no negative consequence on the community or to teachers or otherwise, because the big narrative was, well, even if kids aren't at risk, they're putting teachers at risk. This is the narrative that calcified in our country. But yet we had information very, very early with empirical evidence, millions of children, 22 countries, and they said, we've observed no negative consequence. They met a second time in June, by the way, and made the same determination. We had tens of thousands of kids in daycare programs early on in the spring in America without mask mandates, without the distancing. And guess what? The same observation. There wasn't this explosion of cases. Yet this narrative, we were told, and that people believed. I'm sympathetic to people who believed this because this is what they were told by the experts and by their trusted media outlets, was that teachers were at great risk and that the community was at great risk, even though we had empirical evidence that manifestly showed that was untrue.
All right. Thanks, David. Darrell, Emily, I want to go to you guys. First off, for those of you who are with us today, if you have questions you want to hit the panelists with, you can submit them to Anna Coulter at aei.org. That's ANNA.Coulter, COULTER, at aei.org. Or you can share them on X at hashtag AEI school closures. That's hashtag AEI school closures. Emily, I'm kind of, looking back, what surprised you most about the response to the pandemic and how this played out in education?
Yeah, so to answer that, maybe I can say sort of one thing about where I come from and
Yeah.
like the take I have on the whole world. So I'm an economist. I'm an economist who works on data. What I do is I run a website called ParentData, which is a website focused on providing data-based information about pregnancy and parenting. And the audience that I speak to are people who come with questions and they want to know, what does the data say about breastfeeding? What does the data say about potty training? And they want to use data in making decisions. And so in some ways that building that and then running it and talking to people has sort of shaped this core belief that I have, which is that people want to learn data to make decisions. And that moreover, like having good data is the key to making good decisions. And I think if I had to sort of summarize what was so confusing and frustrating for me about the beginning of the pandemic around kids and school closures and so on, was that no one seemed to be interested in engaging with data. So I came into the pandemic and, we started, it's March, everything's closed. Okay, that's fine. I'm home with my kids. That's going all right. But it's pretty clear, and I think any parent experienced this, that like I could see this was not the best environment for my children. They needed to be in environments with other people. And then, pretty quickly, some daycares, people started writing me and saying, my daycare is reopening. It's like May and my daycare is going to consider reopening. Should I send my kid back? And I was like, okay, well, great. Like, let's get some data on that. Like, let's find out what's going to happen. Some of these daycares are reopening. This is going to be great information. And I sort of looked out, I was like, surely, some consortium, the US government, someone will be collecting these data. And they were not. And no one seemed to think that was like an interesting piece of evidence to have to inform later. So I did a bunch of work, got in touch with all these daycares, tried to do some data collection. Then we come to the summer, I'm talking to these people who are opening summer camps. I was like, great, that's a great opportunity. My friend Steve, he's going to open his summer camp in Texas. He's going to open his camp. He's going to bring kids for sleepaway camp. He's going to do all this stuff. He's going to experiment with filters and this, that, and the other thing. Like, let's get Steve and all his friends to give us a bunch of data. Surely someone will be doing that. And no one was. And so I did some of that. Then we get to the schools in the fall. I'm like, surely someone's going to be doing that. I'm constantly relearning the same lesson. But there was an underlying surprise to me that we just weren't interested in learning the answer. And I think this gets a little bit to what David says, but just like there didn't seem to be the kind of intense desire to figure this out and answer the question, how can we reopen schools safely? Like, can't we all agree how important this is? And the thing we need is to know how to do it or how it's going to go or what are the trade-offs. And there was just no like desire to have that
Well,
information.
it would seem like the research community would have had selfish reasons to do this, just because they could publish articles and win grants and make their name. How come that wasn't happening?
So this is a great question. And there were actually early on when I was doing some of this stuff, there were a bunch of researchers who I talked to about this and who, there was a very particular person at Yale who had said, oh yes, I'm also going to do this with the daycares. I was like, great. And for exactly the reasons you say, it's, like this is a potential publication. I think the issue is that the kind of work, and this is not a criticism of research, it's just a statement about academia, we do not move fast. And in this case, kids were going to go back to school in September. Kids were going to go to daycare in May. The people writing to me were like, I need to put in my deposit for daycare by June 10th. Like, I don't have time to wait for someone to collect a bunch of data and then wait through the peer review process. And so even for, the work, like there was some work ultimately on daycares, which showed actually something very similar to what I got by, email surveys of people, but that didn't come out until like November because it came out in a prestigious journal. It was much better quality in many ways, but it wasn't there when we needed it. And I think that's some of what got in the way of researchers, that like our kind of what we're doing inside academia is not intended to help you make decisions next week. There needs to be more flexibility on that. And that was just not something that was not a kind of pivot that many academics were interested in making, willing to make, able to make. Pick your word.
Darrell, 50 cans, obviously, and a dozen plus states. When you were in the middle of this stuff, I mean, what surprised you most about how this played out?
Yeah, so again, thanks for having me, Rick. I have like a meta assertion and then a policy assertion, right? So the meta one is that we teach our fellows, we have them watch this TED talk that Yuval Noah Harari does called Why Human Beings Rule the World. And it's about like his theory is that because we can share stories, we can layer subjective realities onto our objective realities. And that allows us to cooperate in large numbers flexibly. And this is something that other human species of human being have never been able to do. One lesson for all of this to me is just that when you take 300 million people, 7 billion people, whatever, and you put them in a manufactured reality that is constructed by legacy media and social media, their behavior changes. And they are uniquely vulnerable to suggestion, narrative, whatever, pressure in ways that people who are living in a face-to-face world are not, right? And so I just want to highlight that because I think part of what David said, part of what Dr. Oster said is really about having control of those levers and being able to convince people that the world they live in has these rules. And so every afternoon for like 5 months, I'm watching, Andrew Cuomo get on the tube and tell me if I go outside, I'm going to die. And people are like, shit, if I go outside, I'm going to die, right? I mean, like eventually you get convinced, right? So that was a thing, and it's a separate thing, but it's like the megaphone for all this. So I just want to put that there. The second thing I would just say is that though David has a larger view of the sort of the public economy of all of this, mine is smaller. It's about education, and so the unions play a much larger part in it. And I just want to put this one caveat out there before I try to drop it like it's hot. On May 13th, 2020, which was a Friday the 13th, I was in Georgia, and I'd just given a speech to the Georgia Charter Schools Association, and there were literally people walking around like elbow bumping, right? And so and I'm on the board of a charter school network, and I got a note that we were going to close that Monday, and I called up and I was like, "Great job, absolutely," because I was scared, right? I think, but lots of people, especially in my region of the country, like we were like, "Yo, this doesn't look good," And so I was at the front of the line to close schools. I was to close it all down, shut it all down, whatever. But in the middle of that, UTLA had a sort of a beef with the district over a memorandum of understanding that made the teacher's in-person presence in a virtual lesson optional. And I was like, hold on for a second. There's something else going on here. And for me, that changed the prism of all of this to a political one. And that's when I was like, look, red for ed, right? Like the teachers unions have been shutting down schools for like 2.5 years now, right? Like West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and then Los Angeles, and then Chicago, and then they were getting rewarded by it all the time, for it all the time. And then this narrative or this sort of political ask of, oh, we're going to triple Title I and basically put teacher salaries on the federal balance sheet came out in the elections. And then COVID happens. And then everybody's like, close it all down. And for me, it just seemed like obvious that schools weren't going to open again. And the fact that not that it happened, but that we still haven't properly interrogated it is like the greatest domestic policy failing of my little life, like work on this at this point. Because sure, the teachers union's got a $190 billion bailout, and sure, they managed to oust Trump, which was like part of all of this. I mean, that really turned the pressure up, that summer was clearly a piece of it. And his call to reopen actually dug everybody in, which is like another really important point. I think we saw the same thing on Science of Reading. If you listen to Sold a Story, they're like, well, George Bush likes phonics. It's like, I don't like George Bush, so I don't like phonics. I mean, that was actually a thing. I think this was another, kind of instance of that. But the cost of that is that like 2/3 of 8th graders don't read well now. And people are walking around like No, we're moving forward. We're looking to the future, and I think that's unacceptable. It's unacceptable. So I'm sort of still, I was trying to think about how to approach this conversation today. I'm like, should I bring in some sort of some levity, right? Because given that we're 5 years into this, but listening to David and listening to Emily has me right back on first base. It's still Friday the 13th again, and I still want to have a serious conversation about the incentives that allow this to happen so that it doesn't happen again.
This incentive question is critical. David, in the book, you write a lot about, the modeling that was used to drive a lot of these decisions, to weigh cost and benefits. Emily just explained that timelines are a part of why researchers were getting this wrong. But one of the fascinating things to me was just how awful these models seem to be. And as you started unpacking them, how much fudging there was, how many kind of problematic assumptions were being made. And in fact, that you pointed out that some jerry-rigged kind of one-off modeling done by, entrepreneurs out there seemed to be far more accurate than some of the esteemed influential models. What was going on there, and how do we understand the dynamics and the incentives that got us kind of these predictive models that we put so much faith in?
Oh boy, yeah. Where do we begin with that? Yeah, the models, and for the audience who might not be familiar, these are the sort of flatten the curve meme that people are likely remember, where you could see if everyone followed the instructions, then we'd have a gentle slope of cases. But if you didn't do as you're told, then it would go like this. And these were largely built on, as you said, the models are built on assumptions, and the modelers get to choose the inputs. And if they don't like what the model shows them, they can turn the dials in various ways that they want to get a model to put out, whether they're consciously or not consciously doing this. I mean, one of the models, after I went sort of like 8 layers deep, which I likened to sort of like Russian dolls, the doll inside of a doll. It was a model based on a model based on a model. And finally, deep in the supplement of a study, after I went like 5 layers deep in the supplement, the author said, this figure was chosen arbitrarily. And it was related to what they purported the amount of transmission that would be in schools versus other environments. So I just want to touch on, because this goes back to what I was saying before and to also Emily's work, which is the idea that I'm sympathetic to people who believed a lot of these things because some of them make intuitive sense. Well, of course, closing a school, that's going to help. A bunch of snotty kids running around, that's how people get sick. Or, well, if I have a piece of cloth in front of my face, that should do something, right? But the thing is, the history of medicine is littered with examples, including recent history. It's not just from, hundreds of years ago, where our intuitions are often wrong. And that's why we have science. And that's why, Emily was so important in the pandemic, because she actually attempted to acquire data. And understandably, she couldn't do a proper study and then publish it in a journal, because that's a very lengthy process. But there's a bit of a fetishization of the sort of journal process, that empirical data, when it's out there, and I give lots of examples of this where it's been ignored throughout history. And this is what we had, was actually, I spoke with an oncologist who researches data within the oncology sort of community. And I said, well, does it count from Europe? Because that's not a proper study. And he was like, whoa, he's like, that's better than a study. A study is a contrived scenario. They're making all sorts of decisions. This is just reality. It's just happening. And you can see it empirically. So I think that that's kind of the important thing that was lost, is that there was this dismissal of empirical reality, and including by, unfortunately, the administrators within the education community. We can get into it, but because of the politicalization of the pandemic and because of the acrimonious political environment in our country, you have this very homogenous blob of the education community, of the media, and the public health community, who almost entirely are all in one political party, and that's what they go with. And there was this tribal dynamic that took place that did not allow for the, like the George Bush likes phonics. Oh, then we must be against it. Donald Trump likes ice cream. I hate ice cream. So that was the dynamic that took place during the pandemic.
Derrell, I mean, this feels like part of a broader conversation that's important in education around the interaction between research and reforms. I mean, we're seeing this right now with some of the red state interventions around literacy, around teacher preparation. I mean, how do you think about kind of these lessons learned about the dubious reliability of the research community and kind of these narratives to your efforts to move the ball in state legislatures and state advocacy?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I think you're kind of getting at two things, and David sort of alluded to one of them too, is that like as an organization, we work really hard to build an internal culture that allows ideas to be discussed and explored regardless of the source. So because we are sort of like half in red states and half in blue states, when when Mississippi and Carrie Wright are doing, the Mississippi Miracle, New Jersey looks at, our campaign in New Jersey looks at that and says, we need to do that. We're going to go, lobby Phil Murphy on it, right? So I know that is frowned upon in lots of other organizations, but we consider it a feature, not a defect. So that's the first thing. The second thing I would just say is that, people are complicated, right? So, and we, with all due respect to the master of the dismal science on here, we expect that things are going to, go differently in the field, right? And so the whole, we have this metaphor, it's an iceberg about passing policy and that just being the tip of it, but the majority of what has to happen to improve education is actually below the surface, right? And it happens in implementation and in different states and in different contexts. And that's why even, something like computer science or science of reading or tutoring, or an ESA or a charter school pitch, looks different in New Jersey than in Tennessee, than in Louisiana, than in Colorado, than in New Mexico, and some people, favor kind of like centralization on this, but like people are complicated and states are different. And we try to embrace that noisiness, and it's going better than it might otherwise.
Emily, I mean, you were there, as you mentioned before, in the middle of all this, trying to work with this messy data. Your whole approach is collect what you can collect,
Yeah.
try to share it. It feels like with a lot fewer bells and whistles and being transparent about what you know. How was that received in the academy? What kind of reception did you get from journalists as you were trying to do that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there were sort of three audiences for what I was doing. So one was school districts. And so just to be clear, like when I spent a lot of time talking to superintendents because partly that was how we were going to get the data. And I think the reason we got so many people to sort of participate and to help us was because they were like desperate for answers. They would tell me basically the way I'm deciding about whether to reopen and what kind of hybrid to do and what kind of precautions to do is like I've got a WhatsApp group with 4 other superintendents from the area, and we like talk about it on WhatsApp. And it would be so great if they were just a bigger WhatsApp group, and we were kind of like trying to make a bigger WhatsApp group, basically. So I think there was a lot of interest in trying to get it right at the local level, and even to some extent at the state level. I think there were states who were trying to learn this, who were really helpful. There was then this audience of journalists for the stuff that I did, and I had more mixed experiences with that. I think that the work we were doing, we did have like a lot of there were many journalists that were very helpful getting this information out. There was, I mean, David's pointed this out, and I can see this in a lot of the coverage. There were certainly a lot of prestige media outlets who were very opposed to reopening schools or had taken a sort of particular line about where things should be on that, and who, in some cases would sort of talk about the data that I had, but would say, this isn't perfect. It's not perfect. And I think that was, that's true. I mean, I like first one who would say, that, data that's collected by some, lady in her basement, like it's not as good as what the Department of Education would have done potentially. And so I think,
If they'd
that
collected something,
if
hypothetically.
they had collected it. But the thing about my data was that it was there, which was, it existed, which I think is some of the battle, at least. And so I think, on the journalism side, there was a bit of a sort of, there was some tension here, I think, deriving largely from some, where they were kind of coming into the conversation from. I think in academia, if you genuinely, I think if you ask the sort of academics working in this space, they would just say, well, this isn't research. So I don't think it would be like a good thing, or it was just like, Emily is like an unusual person. She does a lot of different things in addition to being a professor, and this is one of them. And it isn't like the thing we were doing would not have been coded that way. So I just don't think that was something
It
that
was like you were
academics.
coaching Little League or collecting stamps.
It was like a hobby. It was like, that's a super interesting hobby. Like, I like windsurfing, and this person is collecting school data, and people do things with their free time. And that was that because it's not the job. Like, it's not what and it's not the way, like, I sort of, if you were approaching this and to produce a paper, it's not the way you would approach it.
Emily just pointed out that superintendents, were interested in practical answers. I remember spring 2020, my colleague John Bailey and I got about 24 chiefs, and we did this kind of blueprint for how to think about reopening schools, and it was like one of AEI's most read things ever. I think we had a couple 100,000 downloads like that spring. So I know people were interested, but at the same time, David, you and Derrell have both mentioned that, like in LA Unified, for instance, unprompted, the district said to teachers, hey, you only, as we go into closure, you only have to work a half day. You're still going to get full pay. We're going to agree that you don't even need to do synchronous instruction, that you can do this whenever it's convenient to you, that there's no expectation that you're actually going to text with or kind of mentor your individual students in the course of a school week. I mean, given that I've met a lot of superintendents and principals in my career. I respect them like most of them. I think most of them actually care about kids. So, how did we wind up with work arrangements where we allowed teachers to mail it in, where we wound up with Zoom in a room as, something that was accepted as workable by districts? How did we get from point A to point B?
Yeah, I'll go first and quickly, and then I'm sure David will have a more thought out rationale. But two things. One, if you'll recall, like public opinion about teachers has never been higher than it was in the spring of 2020. And while teachers, to use David's word, may not have wanted to be opportunistic and may have wanted to do the right thing, their unions wanted to be opportunistic, and it would have been a disaster to be a local, super who was trying to hold the line on this stuff politically. It would have been a disaster. And I think the thing that people always forget is that the relationship around school, like a parent, the kid, the teacher, and the school, is both compulsory, so it's got a lot of authority, and it's intimate, so it also has a lot of fragility, right? And when you add all that up in the spring of 2020, people were just rolling. They just weren't ready to have sort of like a fair political fight about the fact that I remember talking to somebody on my team about this. We were making the teacher more scarce while driving up the cost of them. I was like, you don't have to be Emily Oster to know what's going on with this, right? Right? Like, you can either negotiate higher salaries at the bargaining table, or you can do them like this and make them the new baseline when you get after it. So it was tough to watch, and I think a lot of well-meaning teachers, lost out in that process, and I think a bunch of kids lost more.
David, I mean, do you have a sense of how did we wind up with these arrangements that, looking back, seem like they don't make any sense?
To a large degree, this was due to an absolute just abdication of power by governors. They really punted, and this had the veneer of well, I'm going to give local control and autonomy. So it had this kind of dressing of that. But the reality was, and as Emily pointed out with these sort of desperate superintendents reaching out to her, that they then tasked people who were completely ill-equipped to be able to make these types of decisions. That a school superintendent is not an epidemiologist. They don't understand how to look at these data, but that's exactly what Andrew Cuomo and all these other governors did. They said, I'm gonna leave it up to the districts. They can figure it out. And they had to do it within certain parameters, but it was extraordinarily rare that you would have someone who was up to the task. And that goes back to, you'll hear this theme repeated by me, and I think Derrell would agree that this sort of homogeny within the education community is, and I hadn't thought about this before as a citizen or as a journalist, but after having done the work that I did, the homogeny is deeply, deeply problematic. And for two reasons. One comes down to a sort of personality type, that when you think about who becomes a school administrator, it self-selects for a certain type of person. These are good people oftentimes, these are smart people who care and they're dedicated, not, casting aspersions in that way, but it still selects for a bureaucrat. These are not iconoclasts. And what we observed during the pandemic was very, very rarely was there someone who had the courage to lead. Instead, they said, and this is what I was told explicitly, whenever people were presented with evidence that I had researched or from Emily or from wherever, or Europe, whatever it may be, they said, well, the other towns near us, they're not doing it, so I'm not going to do it. And I wrote about a couple districts in where I live, north of New York City, where they did open schools full time. And I talked about, why? How did this happen? And it's not because they had more money than other districts, because some did and some didn't. It's not because of some magical thing. It's because the superintendents there happen to have leadership qualities that most superintendents lack. And so that's one big piece of it, is that sort of self-selection. And then the other piece is the idea about, and I'm sure Derrell probably, and Rick, you guys have thoughts on this more than I do, is I don't know how to break the sort of the stranglehold, and that's probably not the right word, but that the Democratic Party has within the education system. It should cause pause for people who work in education. How come I don't have any conservative colleagues with me, or why are there so few of them? Why are so few conservatives going into, go to Bank Street or wherever it is to get their masters and stuff like that? And the same problem, by the way, exists within public health and exists within legacy media. So, and I approach this apolitically. I'm not a Republican operative. I'm not trying to score points. Even for someone who is on the left, this should be viewed as deeply problematic that we have these institutions in our country where it is so lopsided. And that's part of the answer, Rick, about how we ended up in a circumstance where America was harming its children to an extent that other countries simply were not doing, and there was nothing to be gained. There was no cost benefit, there was no trade-offs. This was only harm. Something as insane as that can only happen when there is a massive sort of mass psychosis and groupthink taking place. And that can only take place when you have this type of unified sort of environment within these institutions, like education and in particular the teachers' unions.
And if I can just tag one quick thing on this. So, my boss and I, we wrote these two papers called Fund Everything and Measure Everything in the sort of fall of 2020, because even we were observing all of this and trying to figure out whether or not the right thing to say was open unilaterally. And so we split the difference. We said, if you want in person, you should be able to get it, right? And that is such a not even an escalation, right? It's just if you're willing, if you want to try, let's try. If you're scared and you don't want to, we had this other thing there. And even just embracing that would have been so much easier. But I think to David's point, one, we have leaders in a culture that is risk averse for lots of reasons, right? And two, that would have required a relinquishment of authority in a time when consolidating it was the best and most important thing.
Hmm. Emily, I mean, one of the things that that we just touched on is obviously across the country, some states, some districts opened much earlier than others. Um, what do we know about this in terms of the impacts on kids, in terms of the after effects a couple of years out?
Yeah, so I think, first this gets back a little bit to what David said about sort of people's misunderstanding, but I think it's worth making sure everyone understands just how much variation there was there. There are like in Wyoming, almost every, just what I'm picking as like I think was the most in-person state in Wyoming, basically every kid had access to full-time in-person schooling from, whenever their schools opened, probably sometime in August into like of 2020. So everybo's off in the spring of 2020, but in a number of states, you could
But but
pretty
but
much
that
go
fall, just so for listeners, so by
all of
that
2020,
fall, Wyoming had all the kids back.
full-time in person the whole year.
And what other states were like that? For those.
Many. So many of the red states were like that, places, sort of North Dakota, Mississippi, many of the red states were very, very in person, much of the middle of the country, and, the Southeast. And then you had, a lot of the blue states on the edges, some of which school districts, school districts in, California, probably more so than anywhere else, that had no access to in-person learning until September 2021. And so this is like, there are kids who had, 15 months of no school and kids who had 3 months of no school. And so that is like a really big difference. We think about what explains that before we get to its impacts. There was a very strong red-blue breakdown even within states. So even within a given state, the Trumpo chair in your district or whatever measure of right-winginess you want was associated with reopening. There were exceptions, and I think those are sort of interesting in some of these contexts. So, Rhode Island, shout out Rhode Island, where I live. Actually, there was a lot of reopening, not almost universal reopening of schools. And that was because the governor pretty much, it was Gina Raimondo at the time, pretty much said, you guys have to reopen. It actually got on up in front of people and said, I hear Cranston's not planning to reopen. And if you're a parent in the Cranston school district, you want to call us, we'll help you sue the school district. And they really went hard for reopening and gave the districts a lot of support, to Darrell's point about funding, but also really pushed people to open. So there were some exceptions, but there was a lot of variation. When we look at test scores a year out, a couple years out, we do see you see very clear impacts of the openingness. The districts that were more remote, particularly over that year, the student test scores fall way more. There are some very extreme falls. I think the Virginia was quite close, and the average math proficiency rate in Virginia fell something like 25 percentage points between 2019 and 2021. So that's really typically that would just not change at all. They don't change very much year to year. There are these huge declines. They're much larger in places that were more remote. So we see pretty clearly this enormous declines, pretty clearly declines that are associated with more remote learning. And then, by the way, we haven't seen uniform recovery. So in math in particular, places are kind of crawling back. Most states are not back to where they were in 2019. In ELA, it's quite a bit more mixed. Some places are back, have gotten much better than they were in 2019. Some places have gotten even worse. So, but in general, the impacts of the pandemic retain, and they were bigger for kids who didn't go to school because you learn at school. I don't think this is not some kind of amazing, this is the most important research finding of the planet Earth. You people do learn things at school, and I guess now we know that for sure that they're learning things there.
So what are the, as we look at the education landscape, to your mind, when you talk about it, what's the biggest change that you think coming out the other side of this as we're going forward?
What should we do?
What should we do, or what has changed the most? Either way.
I think what has changed the most, unfortunately, is I think people's attachment to the concept of school. I think we gave a lot of people the impression during the pandemic that school's a nice to have. And I think that's part of what's going on with absenteeism. It's part of what's going on with just sort of in general, some of the attitudes in school. I think it is like we sort of made it seem like it was optional, and that's not the message I think we should be sending about school. And it feels like a very enduring part of the pandemic.
David, partly what I've been feeding you guys, partly has come out of, we've got a ton of questions here. One is particular, how much of the uncertainty around overabundance of caution was due to COVID being a new virus with no historical data to consult? How do you respond to questions like that?
Well, that is yet again part of this larger idea of the public being deeply misinformed that I spend a lot of my book talking about. I mean, it was called a novel coronavirus. This is a new strain, but coronaviruses have been with us for a zillion years, and there is a lot of academic, in the medical literature that describes how coronaviruses typically behave in human beings, and the SARS-CoV-2, which caused COVID, actually behaved exactly like most of our other coronaviruses. We see with regular coronaviruses, that's what the common cold is oftentimes a coronavirus. Those are really dangerous for older people. People die in elder care facilities every year from just a common cold coronavirus. And conversely, children are largely unaffected. They get a cold. There's actually really interesting, several interesting studies that show what you could call sort of like a cross immunization, that adults who lived with children, they matched them with adults similar, health status and demographics who weren't living with children. The ones who were with kids had a lower incidence of COVID and severe symptoms from COVID. Why? They believe because children, in effect, almost acted as a natural vaccine. They had given these adults in their home the common cold coronaviruses, and from the body's sort of reaction to the common coronavirus, that then created a bit of an immunity to the severe symptoms of COVID. This completely demolishes the idea of like, well, children from underprivileged homes who are living with multi-generational families and stuff, they're going to put them at greater risk. No, that doesn't appear to be the case. Let's set aside the fact, by the way, that going to school didn't increase the risk anyway. It was irrelevant whether you're in a multi-generational home or not, because schools simply didn't increase the pandemic. They didn't drive transmission within the pandemic. So the whole premise of the question stems from a place of this sort of false narrative that was presented to the public.
David, earlier you mentioned this juxtaposition that adults could go to bars, could go out about their lives much earlier. In doing the interviewing for the book, how did people kind of square this retrospectively? Like, what was the justification by which that was deemed to make sense?
Yeah, and by people, I can just focus on quote unquote the experts. What I've learned is that, and this is perhaps a banal observation, but that people, and in particular very smart people, are very, very good at mental acrobatics. That we have, motivated reasoning. You can make yourself believe anything is reasonable. And so I remember speaking, this person shall remain unnamed, but a very prominent public health person in our country, talking about, well, all these kids are in school in Europe, they're in these places. And the person said, well, that's Europe, that doesn't count. I'm like, what do you mean that doesn't count? Well, they don't have the same multi-generational homes and their schools are different. I said, okay, have you ever seen the outskirts of Paris? Are you familiar with how densely populated that is? Are you familiar? Because I've lived in Europe for a brief time. Have you seen the schools there? They don't have HEPA filters. A lot of these schools are from a zillion years ago. All these things, just to answer your question, were false. We were fed. I know this is hard perhaps for some of your audience to hear or believe, but we were given wrong information repeatedly, and we were given other information with a degree of certainty that it did not warrant. And we have to reckon with the idea. It's very easy to complain about QAnon and get angry at people like that. That's boring to me. But what's much harder and more important is when the people we're supposed to trust were giving us very bad information.
Emily, one of the questions is, What were the early signals? And I think this is a really useful one. Thinking forward. What were the early signals that the experts, the health officials, school leaders missed or ignored that could have changed the trajectory of practice and policy? So, what kinds of signals should they have been on the lookout for?
So I think there were a lot of opportunities to learn before. I mean, the US was in some ways, a very good situation because, it sort of, there was really no hope of reopening during the school year. So we had like a bit of a mulligan on the 2020 spring. But then, it was like 3 months before a lot of the reopening was going to happen. So I think there was this period in which there was a lot of information one could have gotten. And there was, both information from Europe, and then there was information from what was happening, inside schools, inside daycare centers, which had been open very early on, inside a lot of summer camps, which had opened. So even if you didn't like Europe, you could say, well, okay, I like summer camp. And then there were opportunities, even if you sort of think about the patterns of reopening and the patterns of US school opening, a lot of places that were very resistant to opening have openings like basically post Labor Day. But then there's a bunch of places in the US which open in like even late July, early August. So again, there was this opportunity for like, okay, we're gonna open these places and we're gonna learn something. And I think from one of the issues in all of that was, both we didn't have the infrastructure to learn, but also we didn't have the willingness to learn. When Georgia or Indiana like reopened schools early on, there were these news articles that were like, school reopens and someone has COVID. A student within the first week, a student had COVID. Of course, people, yes, we're in the middle of a virus. Yes, someone does have COVID. And that was kind of the end. And they didn't come back to that story and say like, okay, well, it turned out one person had COVID, but actually like basically it was fine. It was fine. We kept the school open and sort of everything was fine. We just got that one piece of information. And I think that there was a lot of like, either I'm not going to try to learn from this, or to David's point, and with things like the childcare centers, or that sort of saying, well, childcare centers are not high schools. Well, summer camps are not schools. There's more outside. Europe's not America. And my view on this was like, yeah, none of these pieces of information is perfect. Like we haven't reopened schools in Massachusetts, so we can learn from having reopened schools in Massachusetts, but we have, 9 different pieces of information that kind of filter into what we might think would happen there. And let's remember that the choice to stay closed is not free, is not without its costs. And I think that's ultimately probably the biggest thing that was sort of missed in this whole conversation, was we started talking about it like the thing we have to prove is that no one will ever be harmed by the reopening of schools. And that's an impossible thing to prove. I'm sure it's not true, but it's also just impossible to prove. And no one looked over here and said, well, but actually, no, we need to weigh the cost against the cost for kids. That just like never kind of seemed to appear in the calculus. And that was ultimately, I think, pretty much the worst part of all of this.
Absolutely. We got 3 minutes, guys. Darrell, I got a question for you. And then I want to make sure we whip around just for a final word from each of you. On what Emily was just saying, how come we didn't do this weighing of cost and benefits? Like, just how did that not happen? And two, you've talked and written a lot about how the pandemic has fueled this massive explosion of school choice. And is there a link there between kind of this failure to weigh cost and benefits and how this has driven the expansion of choice?
Yeah, so I'll give you a quick hit at my last word. I just think that again, to go to this whole mental model of like follow expertise, like living in virtual spaces, social media, whatever, everybody was convinced or sort of worked under the premise that any risk was too much risk. And so the conversation was around zero risk, not acceptable risk. And that I'll say in the best cases, over-index people's decision-making around things like whether or not we should open schools and whether or not kids might get sick or whatever. It certainly didn't influence whether or not people got to go out and get some shots and get drunk on Friday. So that's the one thing. The other thing I would just say is, like, to your point, this is absolutely at the root of a lot of what we're seeing in like growth of school choice across the country right now. And to me, I think that's a good thing, because what the lesson we should take is that we need a sector of schools the government doesn't run. In Chicago, the public schools were closed, the Catholic schools were open. And if you don't have that side by side, you can't make conversation. You can't have a conversation about trade-offs or whatever. And so a great case for pluralism in the epidemiological space.
Emily, if you have a takeaway from this as we think about ed research and kind of these decisions about kids in schools, what's the top line takeaway here?
We really need to think about kids. I mean, I just think we need to value kids more. You know, even totally putting the pandemic aside, like in the Detroit public schools, 10% of Black kids are testing proficient in, you know, math and ELA. Like that's disgusting and shameful for America. And I just think this is all like COVID is an opportunity that shined, it's not an opportunity, but it did shine a light on a bunch of problems that got worse, but were already there. And if we can take anything good out of this, it's maybe to take another look at schools, which are not really working for a lot of kids, even before the pandemic, and certainly not during and after. And I like that to stay in people's mind.
David, I'll give you the final word. What's your big takeaway after writing one hell of a book on this?
I'd agree with Derrell and Emily, and just tacking on to that we keep hearing about that money is often the solution in America to everything, that we just, and hundreds of billions of dollars were pumped into the schools, part of the ESSER funds. Almost all of this had no strings attached. So money that was supposed to be helping kids with learning loss was instead spent on DEI coordinators and on technological toys and things like that. We are an unserious country if that's the way they were spending the money that was supposed to be earmarked toward learning loss from having schools closed during the pandemic.
Well said. Hey, I'd like to thank all three of you for a terrific conversation, and for just the important roles you guys have played in all of this over the past 5 years. Thank you much, and thank all of you
Thanks so
for joining us
much.
today.
Thank you.
Buy David's book.